Every respectable, educated individual acknowledges the horrors of American chattel slavery. Why then, some ask, were slave revolts not more commonplace? The most famous anti-slavery uprising in American history, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, only employed 3 enslaved people, but the largest slave revolt in American history involved many more, some 500 of them. So great was the threat posed by this rebellion that the white planter class engaged in a systematic attempt to remove it from the pages of history. This is the story of the 1811 German Coast Uprising. Years removed from the Louisiana Purchase, the U.S. territory of Louisiana and the city of New Orleans therein were awash in intersectional conflict between the established French planters and the new American order. Louisiana Governor William C. Claiborne repeatedly expressed his concerns about the French planters in various letters, though he certainly held one planter in good esteem, Manuel Andre, saying in a March 1810 letter to President James Madison how much he admired Andre. Manuel Andre's right hand was a man named Charles Delon, a mixed-race slave driver on the Andre plantation. The mixed Creole population had a complicated relationship with slavery during this period. While many were subjugated, others actively participated in the subjugation of the enslaved, or were even themselves part of the slave-holding planter class. Take, for example, the Louisiana Native Guard, a militia force made up entirely of these upper-class Creoles who, 50 years on from these events, were the only people of color in the Confederate Army. It seemed, for a time, that Delon was one of the latter, as, in his capacity as a driver, he regularly engaged in intense acts of cruelty in order to extract the maximum amount of labor. The enslaved population of the Andre plantation despised Delon, regarding him as Andre's lapdog. This, no doubt, only compounded the surprise when Delon rose up in Red Rebellion. Inspired by the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Haitian Revolution, Delon, in concert with several newly arrived enslaved people from West Africa, had been planning their own revolution for months. In January of 1811, when winter rainstorms brought work on the plantation to a halt, they decided that the time was right to strike. On the night of the 8th of January, Andre awoke to see Delon standing above him bearing a knife. Despite his disadvantage, Andre managed to push his way through Delon and escape the plantation, making his way across the Mississippi. Andre's son, Gilbert, was not as fortunate, being stabbed to death by Delon and several other enslaved people. Delon's company raided Andre's home, which featured a large collection of muskets. Now armed, the rebels began their march to New Orleans. Delon had amassed a large force, and the terrified planters fled before him to the relative safety of New Orleans. This left all the plantations in Delon's path unsupervised, allowing for significant numbers of enslaved people to join the rebels. In the end, nearly 25% of the enslaved population of the German coast had joined Delon, a force 500 strong. In New Orleans, complete panic had set in. Despite still technically being an occupied territory, New Orleans had a remarkably small garrison, but Claiborne was determined to resist. He put together a hard-scrabble force of 100 men, less than a third of them being professional soldiers. He placed them under the command of General Wade Hampton and sent them against the rebels. Hampton planned to fall upon Delon at night, when the rebels were camped out and unprepared. When Delon learned of Hampton's assault, he broke camp and fled with his company, just minutes before Hampton's arrival. In his book, American Uprising, Daniel Rasmussen argues that Delon was employing a tactic of West African tribal warfare, whereby a force denied the enemy battle until the ground was in their advantage. Hampton had underestimated Delon, but as Delon made his retreat, he would soon come to the realization that he had underestimated another. Manuel Andre had pieced together a well-armed militia of 80 men, and met Delon for battle near the Bernoulli plantation. Despite outnumbering their attackers 5-1, the rebels were lacking ammunition, untrained, and nearly blinded by constant rainfall. Thus, few of their shots proved true. Not long after the battle began, the rebels had run out of musket balls, and they began to flee. The militia was utterly without mercy, chasing down the rebels into the marsh and killing many as they tried to surrender. As recompense for his son's death, Andry cut off DeLong's arms, shot him, and threw his body in a fire. In a letter to Governor Claiborne, Andry stated, "We made a great carnage of the slaves. I hope we no longer have anything to fear from this plot, since it does not appear to be chimeric. We must set a great example of those captured, as to not allow any future evils." And indeed they did, as one Samuel Hambleton recounted in a letter.
They were brung here for the sake of their heads, which now decorate our levee. All the way up the coast they look like crows sitting on long poles.
Somewhat curiously, the German Coast Rebellion was not widely reported in the American press, and it seemed at times the proper authorities were very much eager to sweep it under the rug, as is seen in Governor Claiborne's letter to Thomas Jefferson.
I have the pleasure to inform you that the laws of this territory are enforced in every part, directed to be occupied by the President's proclamation of the 27th of October. We have lately experienced much alarm in consequence of an insurrection among the slaves in this vicinity. It is assumed a menacing aspect, but very soon quelled by the prompt and decisive movements of the armed forces of the United States and the body of the militia.
Claiborne's goal was quite clearly to downplay the existential threat that was posed by the rebellion. And indeed, his efforts were largely successful, as very soon Louisiana would become a state, and the Louisiana slave revolt would become largely forgotten. So much so that I myself had a great deal of trouble uncovering primary sources. A great number of the documents I used in my research had never been translated into English, at least to my knowledge. Perhaps Daniel Rasmussen said it best when he stated,
While Nat Turner and John Brown have become household names, Charles DeLong barely earned a footnote in American history. Though the 1811 Uprising was the largest slave revolt in American history, the longest published scholarly account runs a mere 24 pages.
"This act of intellectual genocide cannot be allowed to continue. All good thinking people must learn and remember."